So we've now reached B.B. Price's sixth chapter on scholasticism. I'm going to summarize this in a slightly different way than other chapters, simply because there's a very long section on the varieties of scholasticism. So I'm going to put that as part two, the second video, and deal with the other four sections here. So scholasticism outlined. There were different definitions of scholasticism from different authors. It represents a broad range of intellectual activity. It was, however, a new way of organizing knowledge and new learning in an intellectual setting, and this is its key importance. Although particularly focused on theology, it was also closely concerned with philosophy and came to have a wider impact on areas as diverse as medicine and politics. Its debates often now seem to be obscure, hair-splitting, and irrelevant to modern concerns, but at the time they were central to what academics were doing. Scholasticism was particularly important in the period from 1250 to 1500. The diversion of violent feudal activity towards the Holy Land from the 11th century onwards had mitigated political turmoil within Europe, creating the conditions for a greater emphasis on educational institutions, which eventually came to include universities. The universities themselves were essentially extensions of earlier educational systems fostered by the church, first in monasteries and then in cathedral schools in the growing towns. Universities came to be established mostly in urban centres and closely linked or housed in initially urban religious institutions, though they drew students from across a wide geographical area. They received official recognition from somebody of importance, whether the Pope, a bishop, the emperor, or a king. The 13th century was a period of particular growth, most university charters dating from the early 13th century. They might be acknowledged as a general place of study, a school offering many subjects, or as a corporation or guild of teachers and students, these differences being reflected in their various systems of organization. All the faculties, the arts, and the higher faculties of theology, canon law, civil law, and medicine adopted a scholastic approach to learning. There were a number of important intellectual concerns. One of these, the most important perhaps, was the intellectual stimulus of Plato and Aristotle, newly available in Latin in Western Europe. This led to a learned reaction to their ideas by the 13th century. Scholasticism endeavored to demonstrate that Christian theology was rational and philosophically consistent. Scholars desired to make Christian theology systematic and to distinguish theological understanding through reason from belief through faith, a concern already evident in religious thought in the 11th and 12th centuries, with thinkers such as Anselm of Canterbury, Peter Abelard, and Peter Lombard. Scholasticism was strongly focused on Aristotle. The focus on Aristotle was fundamental, and the major challenge for scholastics was integrating Aristotle's ideas into the framework of Christianity. This focus was also connected to the passionate embrace of reason as the route to knowledge and the use of the textual commentary as the method for integrating and understanding texts. Scholasticism led to the development of new methodological tools, seeking to analyze the basic principles revealed by Aristotle's work. Scholastics developed, in particular, textual commentary as a major methodological tool. As Aristotle's works began to be adopted as official textbooks, in 1255, for example, at the University of Paris, scholarly commentaries became the fundamental means of understanding these new texts. These commentaries could vary greatly in length, from a few words to several pages. They followed the text or were organized around topics. Also developed were the encyclopedic Summa, the Tractatus, the lecture expounding the text, and the disputation. All of these were adopted and developed by the scholastics as means of emulating Aristotle and Plato in the systematic exposition of ideas. 13th century intellectuals tried, following Aristotle, to embrace the whole of human knowledge. They sought to demonstrate the complete harmony of Christian theology with the rest of human thought by means of minute re-examination of every aspect of theology by the light of philosophy. For example, Aquinas using Aristotle's physics in his proofs for the existence of God. Scholasticism came to dominate the academic world, and in many universities, including Paris and Toulouse in France, Oxford in England, Cologne and Erfurt in the German states, and Padua in Italy, it was central. It profoundly impacted the formal techniques of education, for example, with the commentary, exposition, the choosing and ranking of Aristotle's texts for study, the training of students in debating, as well as on the language and content of discussion. It had a pervasive influence in the dialectical presentation of arguments. As we'll see in the next chapter, in the 13th century, there's confrontation between the church and universities about scholastic dialectic and Aristotle's ideas. For example, and notably at the University of Paris, there was episcopal outrage at the impact of scholasticism, with the condemnation of 219 allegedly unorthodox teachings in 1277. Scholasticism and Aristotle's philosophy survived the attack, but it is indicative of conflicts to come between vested ecclesiastical and political interests. Scholasticism had a massive impact and duration. Aristotelian influence through dialectic impacted the consideration of ethics, politics, ecclesiology, logic, and applied maths. It remained dominant in universities for centuries. In the 16th century, Galileo was trained in it, and Luther reacted against it. Now let's turn to semantic issues and intellectual impacts of scholasticism. Semantic issues became very important. It was recognized that disputes sometimes occurred because different scholars gave different meanings to the same word, and as a result were lengthy semantic discussions in the 13th and 14th centuries. More particularly, studying Aristotle gave scholars a twofold concern with language. On the one hand, Aristotle had held that semantic clarity was essential to understanding the world. His commentators perpetuated his practice of making detailed linguistic distinctions, sometimes quite confusingly, as per the contrast between Aristotle's notion of form and Ibn Sina's interpretation of it. On the other hand, the new learning came via foreign languages and with novel terminology, including commentaries by pagans and Muslims. Scholars had to make sense of these. Intellectual impacts were varied. First of all, very fundamentally, Aristotle's paganism was very evident as the full corpus of his writings became available, and it indicated that persuasion evidently didn't have to rely on revelation. The scholastic method was also a means of reasoned inquiry which could be used outside of philosophy, including law, medicine, architecture, and music, and I'll mention very quickly two particular hypotheses in this regard. First of all, we have George Makdisi in an article in Speculum in 1974, who noted that the scholastic method was already present in Islamic law before it developed in the West. He posited that whilst there was no direct evidence for this Eastern scholasticism, khilaf, could have influenced the development of Western scholasticism, but through law, not philosophy or theology. A major objection here would be the lack of any translation of Islamic legal texts into Latin, nor is there any reference to Arabic influence in Latin texts on law. The second hypothesis is from Erwin Panofsky in 1957, who argued that the change of style from earlier Romanesque to Gothic architecture reflected a change in mindset. This is unproven, but a useful stimulus to ongoing research in the architectural shift that did occur. Finally, we can talk about scholasticism as a social phenomenon. Contrary to those who dismiss scholasticism as a narrow movement confined to the universities, it transformed the whole world of education in the Middle Ages. Virtually all university teaching offered examples of it. It also had a wider impact, permeating all aspects of intellectual life and expression, including art and culture. Again, from the 13th century onwards, all significant church debates were scholastic in style. Its logical reasoning provided a new guide for intellectual organization and expression. So thank you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons, Sina Fazel, David Langness, Anthony Lee, Ian Palin, Johannes Rosenbaum, Steve Scholl, Ismail Valesco, Tobias Vetter, Tricia Williams, Jonah Winters, and Gloria Yazdani. If you want to support my channel, you're very welcome to do so. Please like, comment, and share on the videos if you will. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and I'll give links to my Patreon and PayPal accounts below if you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll talk about the varieties of scholasticism. Have a good day.